All right, Shevuos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Shvach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this year in the Shevuos of Besoros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Haba Aleinu L'Tova Shmuel Rabbi Karapkin, mission of the yard site of Shmuel's father, Lipa Ben Yecheskel HaKohen Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsor, Hillary Jacobson Kent, in memory of her daughter, Shifra Zichron Livracha Bas Chana Dina. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Yerachmiel and Judy Noodleman, in creation of the yard site of Yerachmiel's father, Yaakov Ben Moshe Tzvi Zichron Livracha, and Michael and Rachel Troniansky, creation of the yard site of Michael's father, Shimon Yaakov Ben Baruch Elimelech Zichron Librach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need refuah Shavon together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, the Baruch Hu Shem Meretz Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov, and our holy soldiers to be successful B'Chol Maasei Yedehem. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a great daf, really an incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Ches. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Yud Zayin Amud Beis 17b, 18 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows, right after two dots. Zohi mitzvahs aseh sheva mikdash she'ein chayav v'nalav. So Moses, remember again in yesterday's daf, we were hyper-focused on the case, well really two different cases, but case one was where someone was tameh, had a lapse of awareness about their tumah, and then entered into the Beis HaMikdash. And then case number two was where someone became tameh inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself. Those are the two cases we're dealing with. Now, the way the Mishnah phrased those cases was that this is an example of a mitzvah saseh, that if Beis Din were to rule erroneously about this particular case, there would not be what we call par he'elam davar min hatzibor. There is a special offering, a special sacrifice that is brought when Beis Din delivers an erroneous ruling and the majority of the klal acts upon that ruling. So if we look at Rashi, Rashi says, alasei va'alo saseh sheba mikdash. Rashi says, kilomar, al Torah's tumas mikdash v'kadashav. If Beis Din were to deliver an erroneous ruling regarding, again, either something to do with the tumah within the Beis HaMikdash itself or the consumption of consecrated items, bein shu shalasei kigon shenitma ba'azara, dahainu asei devei shachol bein hu shalos asei kigon nitma b'chutz. Now, interestingly enough, there's two different cases over here, right? If somebody goes ahead and becomes tameh within the Beis HaMikdash itself, and then let's say Beis Din delivers an erroneous ruling. Let's say Beis Din says they didn't have to leave under those particular circumstances, even though they did. That's a violation of an aseh, because the aseh, if you become tameh in the mikdash itself, the aseh to go ahead and get out is v'yishalchu min ha'machana. That all right, kol tzorah goes up. Anyone who is tameh is sent out of the machana. That's the obligation you have, that if you're in the mikdash and tameh, to get out. Bein shehu shalos aseh ki go nitma bechutz diika asharas ala mikdash lo savo. On the other hand, if you become tameh outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and then enter into the mikdash, there's a lo saseh, there's a prohibition, and the prohibition ultimately is ala mikdash lo savo. Don't go into the mikdash. So let's say again, Beis Din delivered an erroneous ruling regarding either of these circumstances, right? And someone acted on that ruling. So the halacha is there is no par helam davar min hatzibor. Why not? Rashi actually rounds this out over here. He says, "V'hasam mefarish taima dein chayav mishum dein meviin par bahora ela al helam davar sheshigagaso chatos kvua liyachid aval tumas mikdash carbon olav yorah." It's technicality. Halacha is you only bring a par helam davar min hatzibor. So again, I will say, par helam davar min hatzibor is a carbon that is brought in the situation where Beis Din delivered an erroneous ruling and people acted on that ruling. So the people, to a certain degree, themselves are covered because they acted under the guidance of Beis Din. Par helam davar min hatzibor is brought, but interestingly enough, par helam davar is only brought for an infraction where if committed accidentally without the instruction of Beis Din, would have what we call a fixed carbon. But because when it comes to tumah in the mikdash, we've already seen what carbon do you bring for tumah in the mikdash? What carbon do you bring? Right? Ultimately, you bring a carbon olev yored. So because you bring this variable carbon, therefore halacha l'maisa, there's no parallel davar min hatzibur. So it's a technicality. It's technicality. So now go back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, hey chakai. So what exactly are we talking about over here? So the Gemara, where are we coming from? The Ka'amar Zohi. So remember again, the lashon of the Mishnah was, this is an example. So whenever you say that lashon of Zohi, it makes it sound like you're coming from a broader discussion. So what is the broader discussion? We're actually coming again from Gemara Maseches Harius. So Gemara says, Ein chayav an alasei va'alo sasei shiva mikdash. You're not chayiv a par helam davar min hatzibor, on an asei and on a lo sasei in the base of mikdash. Now again, what's the asei? What's the lo sasei? The asei is referring to a case where you became, tamei inside of the base of mikdash. And the lo saseh is referring to the case where you became tamei outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but entered in under a lapse of awareness. Ve'in mavi'in asham talui al aseh va'alo saseh sheva mikdash. Because you do not bring an asham talui on an aseh and a lo saseh in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay. Aval chayovin al aseh va'alo saseh shebenida. Now, so now remember again, the Mishnah brought up the case of nida. We kind of, blew through this case quickly in the Mishnah. We're actually going to spend some significant amount of time on it today. But you do go ahead and bring a carbon on an aseh and alo saseh shebenida. Umevi'in asham taloi al aseh va'alo saseh shebenida. Okay, fine. Look at Rashi for just a moment. They mevi'in asham talui. Hayechidim shebali adam safek kares. V'tzrichan akasav asham talui. Ein mevi'in osa safek tumas mikdash. Shabbos says. So remember, asham talui, like its name, is a carbon that is brought when there is the potential. It's doubtful liability, or not that, potential liability. That's what it means. Asham is a sin offering. Taloi means suspended. I may or may not have done something wrong, but the stakes are very high. If I did do something wrong, it's generally a kares-bearing prohibition. So because of that, there's a special carbon that's instituted. So interestingly enough, there's no asham taloi that is brought when it comes to tumah in the mikdash, but there is asham taloi that is brought. There is asham taloi that is brought. Halacha l'maisa again for the case of Safek Nida. Now we're going to go through all this. So the Gemara says, V'ka'amar zohi misas aseh shebemikdash she'ein chayav aleha. This is the positive commandment in the mikdash that one is not chayiv for. Ve'ezuhi misas aseh shebenida shechayav aleha. So by the way, just so you understand, why is it that Nida and Tumas Mikdash are both brought in the same breath? So remember again, what's the case of Nida we're referring to over here? Case of Nida we're referring to over here is where a man is having relations with his wife, and in the middle of relations, she says to him, I've become a Nida. So we're going to see there's a number of complications in that particular case, but interestingly enough, what they both represent are cases of entry with Safek Tumah. With that's the commonality of these cases over here. Again, they're going to have reverse dynamics, but they're going to see that's why they're mentioned in the same breath. So the Gemara says, what's the example of a mitzvah? Now the other thing we have to figure out is, what do you mean mitzvahs aseh? What's the positive command? We're going to unravel all of this. So what's the case? What's the mitzvahs aseh? What's the case of the mitzvahs aseh by nida that one would be chayiv for? What's this case? Here we go. This is the case of Mishnah. A man was having relations with his wife, who was tahora. Not a nida. V'amralo nitmesi, and she says in the middle of relations, I've become a nida, upiresh miyad, and he withdraws immediately. Chayiv. He's chayiv for that. Why? Because the withdrawal is pleasurable for him like the entry, meaning that halacha l'maisa, if he withdraws in an aroused state, because there is pleasure from that act of withdrawal, therefore that is considered to be relations with a nida. So we'll see exactly what his remedy is. Okay, so we'll say, so that's the case of nida. And that's why both of these cases are brought together in Maseches Harius, because they both represent what we call entry with Safek Tumah. Okay, so now we're going to spend some time on the nida case. So it's beautiful, whoever that is. Very serene. I would like to wake up to that in the morning. It's okay. Somebody text me that ringtone. Gemara says as follows: Itmar, Abai Aram Mishmei Rabbi Chia Barav. So now let's get into this a little bit more. So Abai says in the name of Rav. So the Gemara says, Itmar Mishmei Rabbi Chia Barav. Chayiv Shtayim. Abai says actually in the case of nida, one is actually chayiv twice. Now, which case? Rashi says over here, chayiv shtayim, haporish min hanida bekishui. If a man goes ahead and, now we're going to have to define the parameters of the case, but the Gemara says if a man, in this case of nida, man withdraws while still in a state of arousal, he's chayiv twice. Chayiv twice. V'chein amar Rava amar Shmuel bar Shua amar Rav Huna chayiv shtayim. What are the two levels of liability? Chad aknisa v'chad aprisha. One liability, right? One chayiv is for entry, and one chayiv ultimately again is for withdrawal. So Gemara says, one second. Havi bar Rabba. So Rabba was very puzzled by this statement. B'mai, what's the case? Right? What are we talking about over here? So Gemara says, Ilei masamoch levesta. If we're talking about a case where halacha l'maisa, the couple is having relations close to her vesas, which means close to the time that she's expecting her period, so the Gemara says, ubiman. Now, again, I will say, there's a lot of halachas that are being thrown at us over here, and we're going to unravel them as they come. So remember, again, the concept of a vesas is that, again, a woman expects her period at a particular time. Now, again, in the world of vestos, there are many different types of vestos. We are not delving into the intricacies of Hilchos Nida right now. The point the Gemara is trying to figure out are what are the parameters of this case. So if we're talking about over here that it was close to her vesas, which means, now what does that mean? If it was close to a time that she was expecting her period, and then let's say again, they have relations, and in the middle of relations, she says, oh no, I became a Nida. And if he withdraws while still in a state of arousal, I can understand why potentially there would be dual liability. Why the dual liability? Number one, why did he have relations with her in the first place? If he knew that she was expecting her period, then they should have abstained. And then furthermore, again, after she became a nida, he should have waited until he was not in a state of arousal to withdraw. The fact that he withdrew in an aroused state ultimately creates a second liability. Okay, so the Gemara says, listen to this. So now here's the problem. If we're talking about that it's close to her vesas, and what kind of person are we talking about? Ubamai, umuvan, betamut chacham. If we're talking about a Talmud Chacham, so the Gemara says, Bishlama aknisa lechayiv. So I understand why there should be liability, or what we call entry, for the initial act of relations. Why? Kasavar, because we'll say in this case, actually, interestingly enough, he's a shogeg. Why is he a shogeg? Because he thought to himself like this, Kasavar, yicholani lival. I thought I had time. I know that my wife is expecting to become a nida shortly, but I thought I had time to have the act of relations before she would actually become a nida. Look at Rashi. Ibetam chacham sheodea shameshamishimat tahora va'amrlonit mesi tzarch lahamtin ad shiyamos. So again, if we're assuming over here that this is a Talmud Chacham, so therefore I will say what? I understand on the front end of things, on the entry, he ultimately again would be chayiv, right? At the entry, he would be chayiv. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, again, that would be a shogeg. That'd be a shogeg case, right? Because again, he thought he had enough time. It turns out that he didn't have enough time. That's shogeg. The Gemara says, however, ela prisha amay lechayim ezidu. But if he withdrew in a state of arousal, then ultimately again he should be chayiv. He knows better. He's a Talmud Chacham, right? She should have waited until he was no longer aroused in order to go out and withdraw. The fact that he withdrew in a state of arousal makes him liable. But b'mezid, if it's mezid, then there's no carbonic liability. So when it's top of Yudches, 18a. So when it's v'iba ama aretz, and if we're talking about ama aretz, edi v'edi, then I will say, then the truth is he's a shogeg in both cases. He's a shogeg for the entry, shogeg for the withdrawal. If that's the case, I will say, then what? That it's two averos in one lapse of awareness. What's the halacha? When you do the same avera twice in one lapse of awareness, you're only chayev once. Idi v'idi, the Gemara says, Idi v'idi, the Gemara says, Idi v'idi, achal shnei zeisei chelev, be'lamecharu. Again, if a person eats two kizeisim of chelev in one lapse of awareness, what's the halacha? They're only chayiv once. So therefore, if this guy's in Ama'aretz, therefore again, he doesn't know about the entry, he doesn't know about the withdrawal, halacha l'maisa again, he should only be chayiv once. Ve'ela, so what's the case? So we'll say second line, 18a, ve'ela, b'she'in samach levesta. It must be a case where it's not close to her vesas, meaning she's not expecting her period. Uveman. And what kind of person are we talking about over here? If we're talking about a Talmud Chacham, v'lo chada lo mechayiv. So then really he shouldn't be chayiv for either one. He shouldn't be chayiv for anything. Why? Aknisa anus, because you also remember again, if it's not samuch levesta, if she's not expecting to become a nida, so therefore it's totally permitted for him to have relations with his wife. So therefore there should be no liability, even shogig liability, for the entry. And ultimately, again, an aprisha mezid. And if he withdraws while still aroused, ultimately that's a mezid, because if he's tam chacham, he knows this, and therefore there's no carbonic liability by a mezid. Iba ama aretz. And if it's an Ama Aretz, the Gemara says, Hudu Mechayiv Aprisha. So the Gemara says, Schad Hudu Mechayiv Aprisha. And if it's an Ama Aretz, once again, can't be Chayiv for Knisa, for entry. Why? It was totally permitted. If anything, he'll only be Chayiv once for Prisha, for withdrawing in a state of arousal. So we'll say, so we're trying to figure out the case. We're trying to figure out the case where you'd be Chayiv Shtayim, Chayiv for entry and withdrawal. Hadra Amar Rava. So we'll say, then Rava came back and Rava said, Li'olam b'samoch levesta. In reality, let's go back. We're talking about a case where halacha l'maisa, she is expecting her period. It's close to her vasas. U'b'talmid chacham. And the boy says he's a talmid chacham. So if he's a talmid chacham, v'talmid chacham l'zu, ve'in talmid chacham l'zu. So we'll say this is great, right? So we'll say he's a talmid chacham in certain areas. And we'll say most of us are like this. We are chachamim in certain areas and profound tipshim in other areas, right? This is the way that life is. So where do you think? Because he's called a Talmid Chacham, he knows everything. He's a Talmid Chacham in certain things. So what does he know? He knows that Allah Chalamaysa, that you have to be careful with having relations with your wife close to her vesas. So in that respect, he was a shogeg. He thought he had enough time before the onset of her period. He was wrong. He was wrong. Again, not intentional violation. He was a shogeg. So he's a shogeg in that area, and ultimately, again, that's why he's liable. But he had no idea about the halacha that you can't withdraw in a state of arousal. So therefore, again, he was a shogeg in the knisa, in the entry, and he was a shogeg in the withdrawal as well. And therefore, again, that would be the case of dual liability. Take a look at Rashi. B'tam tchacham lezu, kilomar yodeh sheisam mushar lifrosh min shosein samach lavestan, kidolma kaman, v'izhartem espenei yisrael mitumasam, ve'yodeh shemeshamish im atahora v'amar nitmesi tzarech lifrosh be'ever meis. So again, Salah Chamaisi is a shogeg because he thought he had enough time to have relations before the onset of her nidos. He had no idea about this halacha that you can't withdraw in a state of arousal. Therefore, shogeg on both ends. Therefore, dual liability. Chayiv shtayim. Beautiful, beautiful. Amar Rava. Rava said, "V'tarvayhu taninhu knisa." Sorry, v'tarvayu taninu. Rava says both of these concepts, the entry and the withdrawal, are both stated in the Mishnah. Knisa tanina, prisha tanina. Both are mentioned. Prisha Tanina. So we'll say, so again, the withdrawal is stated. Diktani. This is our Mishnah. Which is actually, by the way, it's actually a Mishnah Haris. So we'll say, remember again, like one of the most exciting things in Shas in general is, remember, this is not the primary place for this discussion, right? Remember, really, this is not our topic. What's our topic? What's our topic? Really, Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. But in Meseches Haris, this is brought down as a parallel case to Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav. So our Gemara is just mentioning it tangentially. But as often happens in Talmudic tangents often become primary discussions. So so just understand this. In Harius, this is all bundled together. In any event, so Gemara says, it's mentioned in the Mishnah, Tanina, Prishatina, Diktani, Haimishai Torah, a man was having relations with his wife who was a Tahora, Va'amra lo nitmesi, and she said to him, I became Tamea. I became Tamea. In the middle of relations, she says, I feel that I'm a Nida. They both say, again, this would be the concept of Hargasha, right? The woman could have an internal sensation that she's becoming a Nida. So she has this Hargasha in the midst of relations. She says, Nitmesi, Upirish miyad, and he withdraws immediately, i.e., while still in a state of arousal, chayiv. Ultimately, again, he is chayiv. That's the case of Prisha. Knisa Tanina, we also learn the case of entry, Nimtsalo al Shalo. So we'll say, listen to this. If after the act of relations, so again, husband and wife are cleaning up, and a man is cleaning up with a cloth, and he finds blood on his cloth. So what's talacha? What's talacha? Chayavin Tmein. They are both tamei. They're both tamei. V'chayavin bekarban. And ultimately chayav karban. Take a look at Rashi. Nimtza al shalo dam al hamapa shekanach ba'achar tashmish. See, he finds blood on the cloth that he's using to clean himself up after relations. Tmeim. Rashi says shnehem tumas shiva. So this is interesting. So you say, if you ever, it might be good trivia, probably not for the Shabbos table, but interestingly enough, right? If you ever want to find the case, where could you ever have a case of a man who's tamei tumas nida. A man who's tamei tumas nida. So it could happen if it turns out that after relations he finds blood on his mappa, then it turns out that again, actually scratch that. Just keep this to yourself. And anyway, right? So the idea over here is that he becomes tamei tumas nida. Both of them are tmeim for 7 days. Rashi says over here, tmeim shneim tumas shiva himishum nida. V'humishum boel nida. So she becomes a nida. Now again, it happens to be contemporarily, these halachos are a bit more involved. In other words, there are halachos that deal with if a couple sees blood in the aftermath of relations. So again, here the Gemara is kind of presenting it in a little bit more of a one-dimensional area. Halacha l'maisa, it's a bit more complex. In any event, for our purposes today, so she's going to be a nida. So again, remember, I will say, midda oraisa, tumas nida extends for how long? 7 days. Remember, we saw this. We saw this in Smichas Chaver when we did Hilchos Nida. We saw it in Hilchos Nida in our last cycle. So remember again, just important as an aside, the concept that we have of Hilchos Nida, of being a 12-day period, is a combination of the halachos of Nida and Zava Gedola. We kind of collapse them into one. Biblical Nida is 7 days. That's it. And it doesn't matter clean days, bleeding days, it doesn't make any difference. So a woman gets her period, she's a nida, 7 days later she goes to the mikvah. That's it. The construct that we have again is the merging of two biblical precepts into a concept called Taharas HaMishpacha. In any event, so therefore, they're both tamei. If they see blood after relations, she's tamei for 7 days, that's tumas nida, and he's tamei because boal nida, because he had relations with a nida. The Gemara Rashi says, "Devadei ra'as adam told them beila or b'shas bilas tashmish," because we assume that the blood that he's finding on his cloth obviously came from her. So either she was bleeding before the act of relations or during the act of relations. But either way, halacha l'maisa, she's a nida and he is chayiv. So therefore, they're both tamei v'chayav mekarban. So the Gemara says, what's the case? My love b'samach levesta. Are we not talking about a case where she was expecting her period, and therefore v'aknisa, and the liability is for the entry because they should have never had relations to begin with? No, it's not close to her vesas. So what's the case? Va'aprisha. What's the liability? The liability was for the withdrawal, because halacha l'maisa, if he withdraws while still in a state of arousal, there's absolute liability. Prisha lamali. So the Gemara says, but why do we need the case of prisha? Ha tanale. We already learned it. So the Gemara says, ha itzrich lashma. No, I need to mention it again. Why? Nimsa al shela tmeim besafek. Because both said this is very interesting. All of this is presupposing that he's finding blood on his cloth. What happens if after the act of relations, she's cleaning up and she finds blood on her cloth? So what's the halacha? Tmeim besafek. So we'll say in this case, interestingly enough, they're tmeim besafek. Now, why are they tmeim besafek? Because we'll say when she finds it on her cloth, it's possible that she was bleeding before relations, during relations, or after relations. So because of that, again, remember, she's the one finding the blood. Maybe it happened after relations. Now, if it happened after relations, she may be a nida, but ultimately, again, he may not have any liability at all. And ultimately, again, therefore, they are pater from carbon. Since the Gemara wanted to bring up a case of she finding blood on her cloth, therefore Tananami nimsa al shalo. Ultimately, we also brought up a parallel case of him finding on his cloth. So now, is it really possible to set this up as a case where they're having relations not close to the time of the onset of her vesas, right? So this is not a vesas issue, and the liability that we're talking about is for the withdrawal. That really, because he withdrew in a state of arousal, that's why halacha l'maisa again he's going to be liable. Vaha nimsa katani, but that's not what it says. It says nimsa. Nimsa is talking about a case where they find it on the cloth. The nimsa lebasar hachi mashma. Nimsa usually means what? After the act of relations. So the Gemara says, V'ha katani, v'nimsa lebasar hachi mashma. V'ya prisha meikara. V'ya prisha meikara. But I will say, if some case of prisha that occurred beforehand, he parish le meikara havila yedia, and ultimately, again, if that's the case, when he withdrew, there was an awareness of this situation. Amar le Rava sayis maidika amar Rabcha. Truth is, it makes a lot of sense what your Rebbe said to you. Amar le hechi masis. How can you come up with this case? How can you construct this case? The sanya Allah zohi mitzvas asay shebenida shechayavan Allah. This is the case. This is a quotation from our Mishnah. This is the mitzvahs. I'm sorry. So mitzvah say shebenida shechayavan Allah. V'em isa. Now, if it's correct as the way you just set it up, mitzvahs lo sasehi. We'll say again. We'll discuss the asay and the lo saseh in just a moment. But this is not a case of a mitzvahs asay, but rather again, this is a case of a mitzvahs lo saseh. Amrlei itanina chaser. If this is the way you're reading the Mishnah, it must be deficient. In other words, this must be like a chisur mechsera v'hachi katani. So, v'tani hachi. This is how you have to read it. Here we go. About saying, zohi mitzvahs lo saseh shebenida shechayav Allah. This is actually a case of a mitzvahs lo saseh, where if you violated it, you would be chayiv. Now, I'll say, now remember again. The greater context of all of this, just remember, we're not going to delve too much into this, but the greater context of all of this, Meseches Harios, Par Ha'elam Davar Min HaTzibur. All of these are talking about cases where Beis Din gave instruction and ultimately, again, gave erroneous instruction. So trying to figure out when there would be liability in those cases. So Zohi Mitzvahs Lo Saseh Shebenida, Shechayav and Allah. This is an example of a Mitzvahs Lo Saseh, that if Beis Din were to give erroneous instruction, there would be liability. What's the case? A man was having relations with his wife who was a tahora. She said, I am timeya, upiresh miyad, and he withdrew while still in a state of arousal. Chayiv. Ultimately, again, there is liability. Zohi mitzvahs aseh shebenida. That ultimately, again, is violation of a mitzvahs aseh by a nida. Okay, so both say, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, what we see over here is that the one clear case that the Gemara is focusing on over here is a situation where she becomes a nida in the middle of relations. She tells her husband, again, the halacha is he is supposed to wait until there is no longer arousal and then withdraw. If he goes ahead and withdraws while still in a state of arousal, there is going to be liability for that particular case. We saw a lot of ambiguity upon the entry case. How did all of this start? Samuch levesta, not samuch levesta. So it's almost as if the Gemara kind of puts that to the side a little bit. Because remember again, the reason what threw all of that a little bit into a tizzy was that brisa that spoke about chayiv shtayim, that you could be chayiv twice. We were trying to figure out how can you be chayiv shtayim? But if we kind of put that on the side, the case that we're really focusing on over here is the concept where she becomes a nida in the middle of relations, and if he withdraws while still in a state of arousal, there is liability for an act of relations with a nida. If, however, he waits, then halacha l'maisa again, there won't be liability in that case. So the Gemara says as follows. Or I should say, there won't be par helam davar min hatzibur in that case. Okay, so now let's analyze this a little bit more. Amar Mar, perish miyad chayiv. If he withdraws immediately while still in a state of arousal, ultimately again there's chiyuv, there's liability. So the Gemara says, so what should he do? Hechi avid. What exactly is he supposed to do? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna mishmei derava noetz eser tziparnav bekarka. Ad shiyamos vitovia. So literally translated, he should dig his fingernails into the ground until he's no longer aroused, and then ultimately again it will be good for him. Now we'll say what that means is he should wait. Rashi says over here, noit tziparnav kilomar yamid atzma bolodisha ad shiyamos ha'iver. He should wait. He should just literally stay still until there's no longer arousal, and then he should withdraw. I will say, by the way, what's the lashon of noet tziparnav bekarka? So we'll say, so the Maharshal points out, this is the lashon of Yosef, right? The Gemara Maseches Sota. This is the Gemara Maseches Sota. Remember again when the Gemara discusses how Yosef was so tremendously tempted, right, to sin with the wife of Potiphar, but he decided not to. What did he do? Na'atz aser eser tziparna b'karka. Literally, again, like he dug his fingers into the earth, right, and he abstained. He went ahead and he literally held himself back from committing the avera with Eshes Potiphar. So the Gemara just borrows that same lashon over here to talk about this idea that this husband has to exercise restraint, not go ahead and continue in the act of relations, wait until he's no longer aroused, and then withdraw after that. It's interesting. It'll be good for him. It'll be good for him. So just by the way, this is actually interesting. So this also tells something else. Hamishamish meis ba'arayis pater. So this is very interesting. What if a man has relations with a woman who's in erva, but he's not aroused during the act of relations? Right? Somehow penetration occurs without arousal. So you see from here that you're not liable. It's not liable, right? Where do we see that from? Because halacha l'maisa, if he withdraws, as long as he's not aroused, it's not considered to be an act, so to speak, of bia, right? So you see from, so I guess what the Gemara says just extrapolates that if a man has relations with a woman who's in erva, but he is not aroused during that act of relations, that there's not liability for that. The Gemara said, the Isa adaitcha chayiv, because if halacha l'maisa again, you would be chayiv, then hacha my time of departure. Then I was saying this, in other words, if he would be chayiv for having relations with an erva, even in an unaroused state, so in this case, even when the husband withdraws and he's not aroused, there should still be liability. Maybe this case is different. Why? Mishum da'anasu. Maybe this case is different because here he's an ones. In other words, we'll say you can't compare the cases because remember again, a man who decides to have relations with one of the arayas, right, an erva, and he's not aroused, okay, he's choosing to engage in that. This guy over here, remember, we'll say it's very important to understand. No one here started out with the intention to do anything wrong, right? Right. Again, remember, this was a perfectly fine act of intimacy between husband and wife. Something happened here in the middle. So again, halacha l'maisa, he's an ones. So because he's an ones, the halacha says, okay, wait till there's not arousal, then withdraw. But perhaps you can't extrapolate from this case to others. Versus so if he's an ones, ki parish miyad nami niftar. Well, if he's an ones, then let him withdraw even in a state of arousal. In other words, so I don't understand. If he's an ones, he's an ones. Why does he have to wait until he's no longer aroused? So the Gemara says, ki parish miyad nami niftar. Anusu armalei abayi the olam emalacha hamishamish meis ba'arayas chayiv. So listen to this. Sabai says, in reality, in general, someone who has relations with an erva, even if he's not aroused, halacha l'maisa is liable. V'achamai time of pater. So why are you pater over here if he withdraws when he's not aroused? Mishum da'anasu, because again, this is an extenuating circumstance. So because again, but you can't say extrapolate from here to other cases. V'hada amrit ki parish miyad amay chayiv. But again, but halacha l'maisa, if that's the case, then if he withdrew immediately, why should there be liability if he is indeed an ones? Shahayalo lifrosh b'hana'a mu'etes uperish b'hana'a meruba. Because he should have withdrawn in a case where there would be diminished pleasure, but instead he withdrew in a way where there would be heightened pleasure, because withdrawing in a state of arousal will still ultimately give him pleasure from this act. That's where the liability comes from. Amar le Rabba bar Chana la'Abaye. Imkain, so I'll say it's very interesting. Imkain matzinu aruka ukitsara benida v'ana b'miktashna. So we'll say, see something very interesting, right? And now here comes the parallelism. Remember again, as we spoke when we started the shir today, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because remember again, this is very similar to the Beis HaMikdash case. Both are dealing with cases of entry and then again, tumah, right? Entry and tumah. Now again, and just like the Mikdash case is, I entered into the Beis HaMikdash in a state of tara, and then went inside became tameh. Very similar to the case of nida. The act of relations began in a state of tara, and then in the middle, tumah occurred. So the Gemara just points out, and I remember again, we'll say, what was the halacha by the Beis HaMikdash case? Right? You become tameh in the Beis HaMikdash. What's the halacha? Find the shortest exit. So it's interesting. By the Beis HaMikdash, you have aruka and kitsara, right? The long way out, the short way out. And the halacha is you have to take the derech kitsara. By Hilchos Nida, you also have aruka and kitsara, right? The short way and the long way. And what's the halacha? You have to take the long way. Right? Interestingly enough, you have to wait. It's fascinating, right? So by the Beis HaMikdash, withdraw as quickly as possible. By Hilchos Nida, actually, again, you wait for the withdrawal. It's fascinating. So again, Imkain, Matzinu Aruko Kitzara. Look at the last Rashi. Look at Rashi on Amud Aleph. Matzinu Aruko Kitzara. Chilik ben Kitzara va'aruka. Shim herich v'shah pater. Then pirish b'kitzara. Kilomar miyad havichayev. And I will say again, so I just want to point out, obviously, there's like so much information unfolding over here in these cases. So halacha l'maaseh, again, here's the point to remember in all of this, right? So remember the case in the Mishnah. Remember the case in the Mishnah that there's liability for withdrawing immediately. Remember the halacha ultimately again of samach levesta. And again, now the parallelism between the case of the mikdash and the case of nida. Amud beis va'anan b'mikdash tanan. Now, interestingly enough, we are dealing with the Beis Hamikdash. Rashi says v'havile lemisnei nami b'nida hada. So it's interesting. So the Gemara says, why don't you use the same lashon? By the same way by the Beis Hamikdash, there's aruka and kitzara. There's aruka and kitzara. Why not use the same lashon by nida? In other words, you're already bringing down the nida case in our Mishnah Maseches Shevuos, right? You're already bringing it down because of the parallelism. Why not extend the parallelism all the way and just say again, just like you said by the Beis Hamikdash, aruk and kitzara, so ultimately used by nida aruk and kitzara as well. Ella mishum delo dami aruka dahacha, aruka dahacha kitzara dahasam, ba'aruka dahasam kitzara dahacha. For the simple reason that ultimately, again, that they're not similar. Why they're not similar? Look at Rashi. Mishani delo damu daharuka dahacha pater kitzara dahasam ukitzara dahacha chayiv karuka dahasam. It's actually interesting. The Gemara thought it might actually get more confusing. Why? Because as we just said, it's actually the opposite, right? By the Beis Hamikdash, you are chayiv, you're pater for kitzara, chayiv for aruka. By Hilchos Nida, you're chayiv for aruka. Sorry, you're chayiv for kitzara, pater for you're chayiv for kitzara, pater for aruka. So because it's the exact opposite, the Gemara said, you know what? This is going to get confusing. So therefore, again, it did not use the similar lashon of Rabbosai. But again, for our purposes, this is it, right? This is the consolidation of the entire sugya into this one phrase. We have two cases of where there's tumah during entry. One is the Beis Hamikdash, one is Hilchos Nida. How do you resolve the tumah in the Beis Hamikdash? If you take the derech kitzar, the short way out, you are pater. Long way out, you are chayiv. In Hilchos Nida, if you take the short way out, you are chayiv. If you take the long way out, ultimately, again, you are pater. Incredible. That's it. So Maskif Rav Huna Breid Rav Nasan Umi Amra Baye Anasu. And let's go back for just a second over here, right? So Abai was saying before that the reason why there's not going to be liability for entry, for Knisa, right, for the initial act of relations is because the husband isn't honest. Both of them are onsim. It's extenuating circumstances. Alma b'shalosh samach levesta kamina. So obviously, in order to make it an ones, you have to make this a case where it's not samach, it's not close to her vesas, meaning she's not expecting her period. So because of that, again, there was absolutely no reason to contemplate that she was going to become a nida. So the Gemara says, "V'ha Abai d'amar chayiv shtayim." But Abai was the one who constructed the case where there could be dual liability, one for entry and one for exit. So the Gemara says, "Alma b'samach levesta askina." Now the only way to create liability for entry is how? Is if you set up the case as samach levesta. Right, it has to be a case where ultimately she's expecting her period, right? Because then he made a mistake. Now again, not intentional, but he made a mistake. He thought he had time to have relations before she became a nida, but he was wrong. That's a shogeg. It's not ones, right? Why is it not ones? Can't be ones. Why not? Because it was samach levesta, right? She was expecting her period. He just made a mistake. He thought that he had time. The Gemara says, "Ki itmar da'abai ba'ama itmar." You know, Abai's statement was made in a general situation, not necessarily referring to the case of our Mishnah. Okay, so in other words, what Abai was saying was essentially, you can construct a case of chayiv shtayim. How would you construct a case of chayiv shtayim? A case where the husband is having relations with his wife, samach levesta, ultimately close to the arrival of her period. But That's not Abaye commenting on our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is talking about singular liability. What kind of liability? Liability for the withdrawal, right? He should have waited until he was no longer aroused and then withdraw. If he withdrew in a state of arousal, then there's going to be liability. That must be a case of Eno Samach Levesta, where again, she wasn't expecting a period, therefore there's zero liability for the entry. Abaye was saying, just know if you wanted to construct a case of twofold liability, you could do so, Samach Levesta. Beautiful. Okay, so both say, so now we're going to use this as an opportunity to speak about some general Hilchos Nida, which is really quite interesting. So by me, Rabbi Yonasan ben Yossi ben Lukinya, may Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lukunya. Okay, brothers, right? So Rabbi Yonasan ben Yossi ben Lukunya asked from Shimon ben Yossi ben Lukunya, Ashar lebal Nida minay minat Torah. So this is great. He asked him, from where do you know that it is biblically prohibited to have relations with a Nida? So the Gemara says, what did he do? Shakal kala pasek bay. He took a clod of earth and he threw it at him. Now, I'll say, which is another way of saying, what a stupid question, right? What really? That's what you're asking me? What's the biblical prohibition? Now, I'll say, by the way, this is why I think it's also important to understand that they are related. Sometimes brothers have the ability to interact with each other, right? Because there's a love. Right? There's an underlying love that's there, right? So it's like the equivalent of like giving him a dead arm. You don't do that to other people, but you can do it to your brother, right? In other words, right? So lamaisa, like so that's why I think the Gemara goes out of its way to highlight that obviously you wouldn't do this with someone else, even if obviously every question is wonderful, right? Except for the ones that are profoundly stupid, right? But lamaisa, with a family member, right, with a brother, you take a little bit more liberties, but obviously with someone else, you would never chas shalom do this. He took a cloud of earth, he threw it at him. Azhar lebal nida. What are you talking about? What's the biblical prohibition? It's a pasuk. So ve'al isha benidas tum asa lo sikrav. Now, Isha benidas tumasa. I will say it's an up in the pasuk. It's an explicit pasuk in the Torah to a woman, right? To a woman in the tuma of her nida, do not come close. Ella as hara lemishamesh imat tahora va'amra lo nitmesi de lo nifresh miyad miyad. No, so it's obviously okay. I know about the pasuk about a nida. I'm asking a different question. I'm asking about the case of where a man is having relations with his wife. In the middle of relations, she says, I am a nida. From where do we know that he is not supposed to withdraw immediately? In other words, I will say, just to point out, right, if you think about this halacha, it's totally counterintuitive. Right? One would have thought just the opposite. Man is having relations with his wife. She says, oh no, I'm a nida. We would have thought the halacha is just withdraw immediately. So now again, I understand the logic. The logic of being kind of remain in place, ultimately again until he's no longer aroused, and withdraw in an unaroused state. I understand the logic, but it's not intuitive. So therefore, again, what he was really asking is, where does that halacha come from? How do we know that? So the Gemara says, Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kra. This is very interesting. So where do we learn it from? We learn it from Utihi Nidasa Alav. So literally again, her nidos should be on him. Afilu b'shas nidasa tehei alav. So this is very interesting. So the way the Gemara is dashing is like this. Sometimes, even when a woman is a nida, her husband is still with her. What's the case of where a woman is a nida and her husband is still with her? Is this case where again he's having relations with her, she became a nida in the middle of a relation, she tells him, you might have thought that he is supposed to withdraw immediately, kamash malan, he should wait. Now obviously I will say, by waiting, what's happening over here? By waiting, he is actively together with a nida. Right? He's actively together with this woman. There are times in halacha where even though the wife is a nida, the husband is still going to remain with her. Incredible, until the point that he's no longer aroused, and then he withdraws. Fascinating. Sa'ashkechan asay. So both say that's the asay, because remember again, this is fascinating. This is the positive, and that's why I remember again, there was all these lashonos in the Gemara. Asay, lo sasay. This is the asay. So there is an asay that if she becomes a nida in the middle of relations, he should remain there until ultimately again he's no longer aroused. That's the asay. Ashkechan asay. Lo sasay minalan. Where do we know the lo sasay? Where's the lo sasay from? So the Gemara says, Amar Papa, Amar Kra, lo sikrav. So we'll say this is fascinating. The pasuk says, "Ve'al isha betumas nidasa lo sikrav legalos erva." So literally again to a woman who is in nida, do not come close to her. So how is that? How is that related to our case? So we'll say this is fascinating. Lo sikrav nami lo sifroshu. Sometimes lo sikrav also means do not separate. What does that mean? Look at this. So we'll say closer from the pasuk in Yeshaya. So this is saying ha'omrim krav elecha al tigash bi ki kidashticha. So we'll say a little bit of context over here. So again, this is Yeshaya Hanavi was giving Musar. So they were late sonim. Rashi points out scoffers, late sonim, who didn't want Yeshaya's Musar. So what did they say? They said, Yeshaya, you know what? You're very holy. Krav elecha, stay close to yourself. Stay close to yourself. Al tigash bi, don't come close to us, ki kidashticha, because you're so holy. In other words, they were saying, Yeshaya, you're so holy. Don't sully, don't defile yourself by coming close to us. You're such a holy guy. We're sinners. You stay by you. So what do you see from here? Sometimes lashon of karav elecha means stay close to yourself. Watch this. When the pasuk says lo sikrav legalos ervasa means sometimes do not come close to yourself. What does it mean to come close to yourself? To withdraw. Sometimes the halacha says, do not come close to yourself, rather remain engaged with the nida. What's the case? The Torah would say remain engaged with the nida. It's this case over here, where halacha l'maisa again, halacha l'maisa, she's in the middle of relations, and in that case, halacha l'maisa, he says to her, he remains there until he's no longer in a state of arousal. Fascinating. So, Rabbosai, we see the asay ve'al isha, right? Utihini das. Ve'al isha b'nidas tumas. No, sorry. Utihini das alav. That's the asay, and the lo sasay lo sikrav legalos ervasa. So we see an asay and a lo sasay regarding this case. Absolutely amazing. Tanrabanan. So I'll say. So now we get a little bit into some beautiful, not as much agarata, but it's more musar. So Tanabana, v'izartem es b'nei Yisrael mitumasam. You shall warn b'nei Yisrael regarding their tumah. On Rabbi Yoshia, mikan azhara leb'nei Yisrael sheyifreshu min shosein samuch levestan. So when the pasuk says, v'izartem es b'nei Yisrael mitumasam means you shall warn b'nei Yisrael regarding their tumah. Rabbi Yoshia says from here you see that a couple should separate what we call samuch levestan. Samuch levesta means whenever a woman is expecting her period, a couple should not go ahead and engage in relations. The kama, so how far in advance do you have to separate? Amaraba ona. Ona means one time period. So it's actually an interesting halach in Hilchos Nida. So let's assume for a moment that a woman has some degree of regularity. So she knows that she gets her period every certain number of days, and she knows it's by day or by night. That period of day or night when she is expecting her period, the couple should not be together. That's called the ona. So if she normally, let's for argument's sake, she gets her period every 30th day, at night, that entire nighttime period, they should not engage in relations. The previous day is permitted, but that night, ultimately, again, it's permitted on both sides. Just interestingly enough, in Hilchos Nida, because there's opportunity here, in Hilchos Nida, there's a concept of the chumrah of the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua said, famous chumrah of the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua said that a couple should really abstain the ona before as well. Chumrah of the Or Zarua, again, it's a chumrah. Some accept it, some don't accept it. I think it's a more popular of the chumras. So again, if she normally gets her period, let's say on the 30th day by day, so the halacha says they can't be together that daytime period, but halacha might say the previous night they could. The Or Zarua says no, they should even abstain the night before. Logic of the Or Zarua, because even with some degree of regularity, halacha l'maisa, the body shifts, and therefore just as a precautionary measure, better to abstain from the night before. That's called the chumrah of the Or Zarua. We're going to stop over here for today. We're beautiful Gemara for tomorrow. So we're going to start today. Emirat Hashem, a short daf tomorrow. So we're going to start today. Emirat Hashem with some beautiful agarata. Shkoyach, everyone. Tremendous sugis. All right, have a great day, everyone. Yeah, a lot of layers over here.